So I'm introducing Clayton Mooney today. He is an Iowa person, which is great. We love seeing how Iowa entrepreneurs and innovators come back and return and stay with us and build the economy of Iowa. He was born in on a farm in southeast Iowa. He focuses on food and how technology improves processes and supply chains. Added to that, talk about diversification, as many of our entrepreneurs are. I'll never forget meeting Clayton for the first time and telling me the first thing that he is drawn toward is doing the hard thing, which is certainly his MO. He does ultra marathon trail races, and he started off his career as a professional poker player, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that today. More recently, Clayton co-founded Nebullam, an indoor farming company located in Ames, Iowa, and he was the first Iowa company to be accepted into Y Combinator, the #1 rated startup accelerator program in the world. So without much ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Kimley.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to Clayton. So some years ago, I started using for the first 2 weeks of the entrepreneurship class that I teach a book called All In Startup, about two entrepreneurs who meet at the World Series of Poker, one whose business is struggling and one who's been very successful. And so it's a great way for me to start the course. But the first semester I used that book, placed at the World Series of Poker, I had a student in the class who had been a professional poker player, and his name is Clayton Mooney. And so I've known Clayton for a long time. He came back to Iowa, and we're, as Karen said, very happy to have him here. And so he was very active at the Agricultural Entrepreneurship Initiative. He helped run our student incubator program for a period of time until he got too busy with his own venture, Nebullam. And then the investment group that we helped get started, the Ag Startup Engine, has been an investor in his business, Nebullam. And I'm a big fan of it from many perspectives. He started taking direct customers after COVID hit. And so Patty and I are subscribers to Nebullam. And so when we're done with this, I will have a salad with Nebullam lettuce. It's just a terrific product. So Clayton's always generous with his time with students and others at Iowa State University and helping us build our ecosystem that's better for entrepreneurs. And Clayton, thank you for being with us today. And we look forward to you sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks everyone for having me. Excited to be here, and hopefully you all can keep me in the lines of rambling for the next 90 minutes. So I wanted to start off with just a couple of slides to show kind of where I started and how I ended up in Ames for the first time. Can someone allow me to just share my screen? Oh, there we go.
Yep.
All right. Hopefully everyone can see that first slide. I won't full presentation mode because I'd like to just jump around whenever other questions pop up. But to give a little bit more context, so I grew up in southeast Iowa, just outside of a really small town called Blakesburg. Grew up on a family farm. Did not think I would end up wanting to do anything ag or food related. When I moved to Iowa State in 2008. So in 2008, I transferred in as a junior with the focus on business economics, the plan to go off to law school and become a patent attorney. And I lasted 2 semesters before I dropped out to pursue a poker career. And when I say poker, most people picture you out in Vegas or at a tournament somewhere playing live. And about 10% of my poker career was playing live between Vegas and European poker tour stops. But most of my days looked similar to this with online poker. So to me, it was very much a mathematical science, playing somewhere around 40 tables of online poker at once. So a little over 3,000 hands of poker an hour. And the career was going well, and I was enjoying it, and I treated it like a business myself. I had 3 different revenue streams. So myself playing poker, and then I also coached and charged an hourly. And then I invested in micro stakes and smaller stakes players. And then in April of 2011, I woke up one morning to receive this message. And essentially, the US government had taken down online poker because it wasn't properly regulated here in the States. So at that point, I had a decision to make. and I decided to return to Iowa State, finish up a degree, but I completely switched from business economics to a degree in English. And the reason being was I wanted to focus on becoming a better storyteller and a writer because I started to realize the importance of communication. I think I want to pause there for now and circle back with slides. There we go.
Clayton, I love the idea of English major. I wonder if you might talk about those lessons learned because, of course, that's every parent's biggest fear is that their student is going to go to school and become a creative writer, right? And and ironically, that's not what my master's is in as well. And so can you share a little bit about what you learned and how you use all those storytelling skills and what your experience was on the way to your business?
Yeah, so it really starts with, I focus on creative writing fiction. I've been drawn and I'm a big nerd of science fiction. And while playing poker, I started blogging a lot about the math behind the game. And then my trips to World Series of Poker or really important hands at final tables in an online poker tournament. And the feedback that I received from quite a few readers was the fact that whenever I wrote about the math behind the game, it was pretty straightforward. Whenever I tried to tell a story, it was all over the place. It wasn't succinct. I didn't simplify it. And that's the feedback that ultimately led to when I returned to Iowa State, just wanting to become a better overall writer. As I jumped into becoming an English major and then adding a minor in technical communication, I kind of rode the line between two different focus points. So one on the creative writing side, and how do you capture a reader's attention right away? But on the other side, technical communication definitely helped me to think about taking some kind of complex system or process and simplifying it. And later I would actually put that minor to use in my first job after finishing up at Iowa State and moving to Denver, where I worked for the marketing and technical department for a Fortune 200 company. And I worked with engineers who would bring in a product and say, this is what we need it to do. This is the standard operating procedure that we've started the framework for. And it was my job to essentially dumb it down. And leading into starting companies, it's been really important to think about the architecture for communication when you start that foundation for the company you're actually wanting to build. So there's a quote out there by Ben Horowitz that it's the CEO's job to design and implement the architecture for communication. That's really stuck with me throughout the years. And no matter what we're doing and how complex it is, such as Nebullam being hardware, software, and living organisms, we need to simplify it so more people understand it. And that ultimately just helps your company to have traction more easily. You're muted, Karen.
I think I would love to give a chance. We just had a question pop in. I'll let Nakaya ask it, but I just want to premise it this. One of the things I find so interesting about your story, Clayton, and it's something that a lot of innovators have in common, is you're a bit of a polymath. You have the math and you have this deep appreciation for story and writing. So I'll let Nakaya ask our audience member question, but I think it will lead to an interesting reflection on how you bridge those two worlds.
Awesome.
Hi, Clayton. My name is Nakaya Rucker. I'm really excited to dive deeper into your story, really. Just you going from poker and then into creative writing alone, I think that's incredibly intriguing. So I think that this will be a lot of fun. And I doubt that this will be the last question that we have. So this question is from Brandon, and Brandon wants to know, can you talk about the math you use for poker? Do you use GTO? What is your best advice for an aspiring poker player?
Good questions. So yeah, GTO references game theory optimal, and I try to apply a game theory optimal mindset to almost everything I do. Something to note in playing professional poker, there's a few directions you can go. So either you can be a cash game player or you can be a tournament player. And I was primarily a tournament player. So most of my months, it accounted to about 25 days out of every month, very high variance. So I would lose money. The other 5 or 6 days of the month, you would hope to win and then have a good ROI month to month. That was really important for me to realize that I needed a proper sample size from the game. So if you just play one random tournament, you could get lucky, you could do well, but the majority of the time, that one tournament, you're not going to have a good result. So you need to play thousands and thousands, and in my case, hundreds of thousands of tournaments, millions of hands of poker, just to look back and understand that sample size. Best advice for someone starting out is start with the fundamentals of the game and understand the math behind each hand and your positioning at the table. And then from there, bankroll management is really, really important too. You don't want to run out of money. So just understanding your risk versus reward when you start off with whatever your bankroll is and how much you can afford to risk in a poker tournament.
Thank you. And then I have a personal follow-up question. I would like for you to discuss the transition from poker to communications. Was that something that you thought immediately of, like, this is what I'm going to do next? Like, even if you hadn't received that notification that you did, that I'm sure is pretty alarming, was that always the next option for you? Or did you just quickly pivot? Did you have a moment, any moments of doubt or questioning? I feel like that's such a drastic change. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that was a steep learning curve for me, jumping into wanting to become a better writer. So when online poker went down, I had a couple of friends who were moving to Costa Rica to continue playing. And I actually thought it would just be a matter of months before it came back regulated. But during that time, so April 2011, it goes down. I told myself I wanted to go to World Series of Poker in Las Vegas that summer. So I went out there, and that was kind of the last hurrah before realizing it wasn't coming back anytime soon. And when I made my mind up to become a better writer, I had this moment of, okay, I probably need to just start with an English degree, and then I need to add something to it that'll help me land a job, not necessarily in teaching. So towards the end of wrapping up that degree with 60 some credits over just a few semesters, I had no game plan whatsoever. And that's hopefully something I can use for encouragement to anyone listening. If you're coming towards graduation and you don't have a game plan, that's okay. You'll figure it out as you go. So for me, I knew I was moving to Colorado, and I told myself, if I like storytelling, I should probably try to find a marketing position. So I jumped out there, applied for 3 different companies, had a couple of offers, and went with the one that ultimately I felt like I could grow the most. And that was essentially my only foray into what I consider corporate America. And 9 months in, I had an epiphany of, if I wanted to become a writer, and I felt like there was just no limit on the direction I could go. And I had to run my ideas through multiple people to get the yes to run that as a marketing campaign, let's say. That didn't jive well with me. And I realized I made a really bad employee. And at that point, I had just started doing some freelance writing and taking projects that I liked, where I could use more of a creative lens on. So that was helping with some income, but I was naturally drawn back to moving abroad to play and coach online poker.
Well, thanks, Clayton. I think now would be a great time to ask you about your current venture, to go in a little bit about Nebullam and what it does, how you came to found it, and what you're excited about, what's going on with it right now.
Sounds good. I'll share my screen again here. Jumping down to, I'm going to start here if that's okay. So leading into Nebullam and how we actually arrived there, my first company I co-founded was a company called Kenosol. And in 2014, after meeting Kevin Kinley and Dave Krogh and Econ 334, that's when we were first started working on Kenosol. And the focus for Kenosol was, how do we curb food waste in developing regions? So we focused on a solar-powered food dehydrator for subsistence farmers, primarily in Eastern Africa. We took that from really ugly but working prototypes into a commercial launch, and ultimately got that product into a little over 40 countries worldwide. And during the time of building Kenosol, an old college friend from Indian Hills Community College, Dana Poole, reached out to me and said, I have some questions around starting a company in the food space. I'm just looking for a little bit of feedback. And at that time, I was also thinking about how do we create access to reliable local food, so in our own backyard, and what does food security look like for here, starting in Iowa. And that ultimately led to having a conversation with Danon around indoor farming and how he saw indoor farming as having its place in the future and being inevitable. And when we look at indoor farming, I mean everything from a greenhouse to a vertical farm to someone's basement growing microgreens. But when you look at commercial scale, the industry as a whole takes a really long time for an indoor farm to become profitable. And that's because most of the growing equipment is antiquated. So it's usually stacked. So you have your equipment, your lettuce, your lights, equipment, lettuce, lights. And as you can see from the picture there, you need a lot of aisle space, which eats into production space. And then there's little to no software that actually runs the equipment and the day-to-day. So at Nebullam, we started addressing this problem by flipping a couple of the methods. So instead of horizontal growing, we went with vertical. And some of these pictures here, this is one of our earliest vertical prototypes. So it's essentially a plant wall where there's lettuce growing out of both sides. And then we focused on the hardware producing as much food per square foot and the software acting as the on-site horticulturalist. So reducing labor as much as possible per square foot. And a little bit more about our traction where we were at going into beginning of last year. So in May 2019, we established what we called the model farm for Nebullam to really prove out our technology and our unit economics here in the Iowa State University Research Park. We established manufacturing partners also here in Iowa. Their engineering teams were able to get on site and walk through our prototypes and help us take that to commercial scale. So what you're seeing in the picture there is what we consider rows of our growing equipment. Each row is 40 feet long, 5 feet wide, so a couple hundred square feet. And each one of these towers and these rows produce about 3,000 pounds of lettuce each year. And we were moving right along with growing both lettuce and microgreens, such as broccoli sprouts and micro basil. And all of our revenue was coming from wholesaling to restaurants and grocers here in central Iowa. And when we saw the writing on the wall that it was inevitable that restaurants were going to close and COVID hit, we asked ourselves, now what? Overnight, about 3/4 of our revenue and 3/4 of our plants didn't have homes. So in 6 days, we pivoted to a direct-to-consumer subscription service. We launched eatlettuce.com. and essentially allowed Central Iowans to go to our website in just a couple of clicks, sign up for a weekly or every other week delivery of lettuce or lettuce plus microgreens. And we harvest and deliver same day, year round. And a couple more stats on kind of how we wrapped up 2020. Something we pride ourselves in is a higher retention rate. If anyone out there has tried different meal kit delivery services, the churn rates are really, really high. So it costs those companies just a lot of money to try to keep a customer. So we focused on that customer retention and making sure we're addressing all of their problems and all their issues and questions. Then we've also focused on helping our subscribers think environmentally. So we recycle and reuse the boxes and the bags that we put out for delivery with each delivery. And then two other facts that we're really proud of as a small but mighty team is the fact that when we harvest on, let's say, a Wednesday morning or a Thursday morning, from the time we harvest that lettuce to the time it's on someone's doorstep is an average of 180 minutes. And since we're focused on starting with the Nebullam farm here in Ames that serves central Iowa, we're focused on keeping the food miles really low. And then we ultimately want to launch Nebullam farms in other locations, starting with Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Iowa City.
So Clayton, you talk about the difference between your churn rate and those of some of the home delivery. Why do you think that is? What's different?
I'd like to think that it's because I'm obsessive with the customers, maybe too obsessive. Some of them have told us we reach out asking questions too often. But that's something that, you don't know what you don't know, right? So when we first started Kinosol, it took us almost 2 years to realize that our customers and users were different. And from there, having to really iterate upon the product based from the user feedback. And same thing with Nebullam. Going from B2B wholesaling, where let's say working with a restaurant, we are one of 50 or 60 suppliers. We didn't have the proper amount of time to get in front of the head chefs and or the owners. And we didn't get aggressive enough with getting their feedback on products. And then once we switched to the direct to consumer model, we realized that with every delivery, we were going to send a confirmation email. We wanted to make sure feedback was really simplified. So now with each delivery, we have just a 2-question survey as a link. We encourage people to complete that every time. And if there's any issue, any questions, I try to get back to them as soon as possible. Essentially every hour outside of midnight to 4.
I have so many questions, Clayton. The first one will be, will you come to my class, please? You are like the epitome of everything that we have in design. I have one particular question, and take me from there. And I see that it connects with our students' questions. Is it fair to say that your systems thinking in poker, and then your dive into how do we communicate the message, is like the biggest asset that you got in order to have these successful pivots? Every single time that you encounter an obstacle or hurdle, instead of seeing it as a hurdle, you became better and better and better and going to the focus of the innovation path. So do we all need to start learning poker?
So I'll be happy to come and speak to your class. Two, I think, Sam Altman from Y Combinator wrote a blog once that mentioned, if you want to become a tech startup founder, you should learn poker. And I thought that was really interesting that he covered that. And it really is, a process of thinking or design thinking that leads you to the story you have to tell in poker. So as an example, if you're dealt a certain hand and you make a bet and you are bluffing, then for the rest of that hand and all of your bets, you have to try to tell the story that you're not bluffing to your opponents. And so every one of those moments you get is, in my opinion, a chance to experiment. And that's why it's all about sample size. If you do enough experiments, you'll figure out something that works. In thinking about the communication, the architecture around that, and how that kind of came from a poker background, is someone told me a statistic right when we started Keenasol that 9 out of every 10 companies fail. And that's true on paper, but in my mind, I process it as, okay, that means I just need to start 10 companies to find success. And I think having that mindset and then a poker mindset about just understanding the sample size and being process oriented all kind of came together to hopefully help me develop a little bit more grit. And I'd say, over the last 6 years of building companies, I like to joke that I'm aging in dog years, but with that, I'm also, getting 7 years of wisdom each year if I just learn by fire and do all these experiments with companies.
Clayton, I wanted to talk a little bit, let's dive a little bit deeper into diversification, because I think that's something you do exceptionally well. And kind of to riff off Anna's question, you have done a great job at really creating this robust platform of intellectual accomplishments as well and academic accomplishments, as well as relationships and network. If you were to design the ultimate framework, what components would be in your framework to be able to pivot, build, and really be that not employee person?
Yeah, good question. So from my side, whenever someone asks, what success is, the first 2 words that come to mind is grit and gratitude. And I think that combination is really important for someone starting a company, because grit, you have to have the perseverance. The majority of time, things aren't going to go according to plan.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to persevere there. Whereas in gratitude, there's no way you can go at it alone. And that's something that a book recommendation I would have is the E-Myth Revisited. And in that book, they talk about how you fall into kind of 2 different categories as an entrepreneur. So you have the manager that feels like they always have to put together the architecture. They always have to be on top of everything. And then the technician who feels like if they want something done, they have to be the one to do it. And those two beliefs you have to let go of because it takes a team. And you have to go out in search of A players so they can hire more A players, and you can have a team to go after a championship, which I would consider an acquisition for a tech company. But that's really important to understand that it's going to take a team. So the grit and gratitude comes into play. And then something else that helps me, because I'm very much a visual learner, is as we look at essentially the holes and the weaknesses of, let's say, Nebullam, I see it as, here's a puzzle. There's probably thousands of pieces. We don't have them all yet. So we need to go in search of these missing pieces. And in our area, we plan to have an exit. So we plan to get acquired and sell the company in the next, let's say, 5 to 8 years. And if that's the case, here's the puzzle pieces that we have now. This is great, but how do we go out and find those missing puzzle pieces? And whether that's a key team member or a key partner or a whole new subset of customers, that's something that I look at everything just as a puzzle and in search of those puzzle pieces.
Thanks, Clayton. Our question board is just lighting up. The students are really excited. So I think I'll turn it to Nakaya and get some of those questions coming your way.
Absolutely. Thanks, Abram. So we do have a lot here. So I'm sorry if it looks like I'm getting to the point. I just want to try to answer as many questions as possible. So we have a comment and a question from Lydia. I'd love to hear more about approaching higher education as a way to shore up or develop skills in a specific area, rather than as a way to expand on existing interests or passions. I think that's not the way a lot of us approach higher education. And then kind of like a segue to that comment or question is, how does your degree help you now with Nebullam?
Yeah, so I think some people are really good at focusing on one thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas in my mind, I guess coming and stemming from the 40 tables of online poker at once, I like to just always be in just go, go, go mode. And if it were just poker that then led into startups, I think I would feel more all over the place. Whereas in my degree specifically helped me to think about the framework, especially if I were writing a story. It was, okay, here's the beginning, middle, and end. Fill in the sections to really connect those. And I think, an English degree and a philosophy degree are very undervalued. And you see a lot of statistics, and it makes sense, if you, let's say, are in a college of business, going into business. But I think liberal arts and sciences college, the framework for just thinking, whether it's problem solving or creation, is very, very valuable. And I look back and I'm very grateful that I added the minor in technical communication, because that took it to a whole nother level of not just creative writing, but here's some real world products or real world situations or problems. How do you approach solving them? Another thing that writing helped me to do is myself. So I've written a bunch and just published a children's book earlier this year. And most of my writing I haven't published, but most of it is short stories, short science fiction stories. And I really like the concept of starting with how I want the story to end and then working backwards. And I think an English degree really helps you to understand that as well. It's all of that framework. And it helps keep me grounded in times where I just go back to my poker brain of I've just got to go, go, go.
Absolutely, thank you. So starting with the end in mind, really. One other question, or several, can you speak to some advice that you would give to a first-time innovator? Angel has a question about that, whether you're a student or maybe you are 20 years into your profession and you want to go a different route. Could you speak to some tips and tricks that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, so I'll start with, everyone has imposter syndrome, and you just don't know what you don't know. The good news is, especially if you're college aged, you're way ahead of the curve, because I think the average entrepreneur is in their 40s now here in the States. So don't feel like you need to have more information or more wisdom before getting started. Just start with something. And if you have a problem you want to solve, it really starts with customer discovery. And I know I've made the mistake with almost every company I've co-founded, that it didn't start with making sure to interview the potential customers to see if you were actually solving their problem. And that's something that I know I was a broken record while running the Aggie I student business incubator, because I wouldn't let anyone show me their prototypes, their features of their app, anything cool they were working on until they had gotten through 70 customer discovery interviews. And for me, it was all about that sample size. So you go out and talk to 70 potential customers. You ask them questions around the problem you think you're solving for them. You test your assumptions, and then you come back to see if you were right or wrong. And most of the time, you'll be wrong at the beginning, but getting that feedback and being able to iterate from that customer is going to save you a lot of capital and heartache and time in the future.
Absolutely. I ran across a quote recently, and I can't recall the person's name. I'll put it in the chat. But it basically says that we spend too much of our time building the bridge and not enough time focusing on the people who actually walk across it. And that's exactly what I thought of, what you were just saying. If Abram, if you want to take it back over, we have a few more questions, but I'll sprinkle them in. I don't want to share all of them right now, but thank you.
No problem.
I really like your discussion of the idea of starting with the end in mind and kind of that reverse engineering. I know you had sort of mentioned your experience coaching, and I would love to hear you reflect on that kind of how you think about developing skills. You've already talked about diversifying, fill it in, but maybe meditate a bit more on how you go about finding that puzzle piece of yourself and filling it in.
Yeah. So I'll talk about two sides of this. So one, as far as when I think of a coach, it really is about accountability to me. So today, like I'm happy and pretty open as a person to share that I have 3 coaches in my life. So one, I have a running coach who is helping me to focus on the process of ultimately running 100-mile races. And then next, I have a founder coach who is there for me to bounce ideas off of, but also to hold me accountable that this is the vision of the company, to make sure I continue working on it and not just in it. And then lastly, having a therapist to really talk about the mental state that you're in, especially as building a company is just a roller coaster ride. I think that's really important for founders and entrepreneurs to not feel like they're on an island. So I have 3 coaches keeping me accountable. On the other side, my experience with coaching, so it started with online poker and started with a couple of friends who wanted to play smaller stakes. And they said, teach me. It looks like you're moving up in stakes. I want to learn and at least just play as a hobby or as a side passion. And when I was thinking about, and I wish I could have learned a lot more in a shorter amount of time, but it was quite the crash course for online poker for me for the first year and a half. And when thinking about coaching someone in poker, you need to understand what they want to accomplish with it. So if they just want to be a hobby or recreational player, that's fine. You probably don't need to dive into all the math. You probably just need to start with, here's the foundation, build upon that foundation of your fundamentals, and just make good decisions and understand what bad decisions are and why you made them. Whereas, and if they want to become a professional, it's jumping in and understanding that you're going to be dedicating your full-time work to the game, but realistically, you're only going to be playing the game about half that time. The other half of the time, you're studying hands and all of the math behind all of the hands and your decisions at each step of the way in playing a hand. And that takes a lot of discipline, because if you want to play poker full-time, you would think you just jump in and start playing. But then as soon as someone tells you have to look at a screen and do math equations for half of that time, it can be discouraging. So I always started with, what do they want to accomplish by the end of it and what direction do they want to go? And that helped me put processes and levers into place of, you're going to need to play 500 tournaments at this buy-in level. We're going to review those hands. And then if you had a 10% return on investment or higher, we can move you up in stakes, and just trying to keep as close to as possible to that framework. But another coaching experience I have is, so I was a late bloomer in boxing, but I jumped into boxing upon moving to Colorado. So I was 25, about to be 26, and had always wanted to box, never had the experience. The only other sport I played growing up was baseball, so pretty different. And I learned how to box in Denver at the 20th Street Gym. And then I continued boxing when I moved to Ireland, to Dublin. And that was a very steep learning curve for me. A lot of individuals and sparring partners had been working and sparring and boxing since they were 10 and 11 years old, a little different. But then once I moved back to Ames, I jumped into the Iowa State University Boxing Club. And of course, being too old to compete, I fell into just a natural rhythm of coaching. And that has been awesome and rewarding for me. I am usually the first sparring partner among kind of new recruits and working with everybody. And in 2014 and 15, Iowa State produced a two-time national champion, Olivia Meyer. That was awesome to be one of her sparring partners and see that entire process from getting to regionals, going to nationals, and winning. And today, still a coach for Iowa State boxing. And I think boxing and the discipline you have to have around it, it's very similar to poker in a lot of ways, because you can't just jump in the ring and box. You know, half your time is going to be shadow boxing and working outside of the spotlight, so to speak, to put that time and effort in.
You know, this is such an interesting conversation. I'd love to hear you expand briefly. I get the sense from your life and how you talk about things that you're someone who is naturally able to link motivation to hard work and keep those things self-generating. But I think a lot of us may struggle with maybe aspects of our life where I really need discipline in this area to reach my bigger goal, but I don't feel like doing it. Could you talk a little bit about either personally or how you've worked with others to sustain motivation for challenging areas of the hard work?
Yeah, I wish the phrase was it Scrooge McDuck or somebody, the work smarter, not harder. I wish that were applicable as easily as you think it is. But building a tech company, it's work smarter and work harder. And oftentimes, a founder falls into a rhythm of they are so related to their company. That's who they are as a person. So if someone mentions their name, they instantly, everyone's like, oh, the company. And I think that's important to try to separate yourself from that, because statistically speaking, that company's not going to work out. So if you have to wind down that company at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that your career is over. It just means that chapter is over. When it comes to that discipline and trying to stay motivated, I'll go back to the accountability side. So let's say, if you wanted to get into running, when I got into running at the age of 30, so a few years ago, I was, again, a late bloomer there, never really enjoyed running, ran a little bit for boxing, but not a lot. And for the first year, I just did 5Ks. I led up to a marathon, and I realized I was really bad at it, and I didn't know what I was doing wrong. And as you get into longer races, your diet comes into play for everything, especially if you're going to be running for 6 or 8 hours. So getting a running coach, someone who has been there, done that, was so important. And same thing with a founder coach, someone who has been there, done that. And, talking with a therapist or getting someone to hold you accountable of this is what you're working towards. Having those weekly or every other week check-ins or even monthly check-ins is phenomenal. I highly recommend everyone just having a coach. And something else that I come to mind with is if you have a coach, a lot of people think, you get one when times are tough, essentially. And so that's being reactive. So how can you be proactive with it and just kind of stay ahead of the curve of if you think that there's a sign of times are getting tough or you're losing motivation, how can you just right then and there set a plan in place for becoming proactive with it? And another thing that I want to touch on too is on the discipline side, I learned by fire a lot. So when we pivoted Nebullam from B2B wholesale to a direct-to-consumer subscription service, we had no idea if it would work. And we knew that we had to launch it as soon as possible. Otherwise, we were just going to be harvesting a bunch of plants with nowhere for them to go. And the rhetoric that helped me to understand, no matter what the result was, to just understand the process, was treating it as an experiment. So that word really helps me if I'm about to make a decision on a direction to go is, okay, this is an experiment. And how quickly can we get a proper amount of data to make a decision of if it's working, do we double down? Or if it's not working, how do we go on to the next experiment? I think that helps. And that stems from, so my parents, my mom is a painter. And I remember as a kid, she would always ask me when she had, let's say, a canvas or she was painting some big piece of art, and I would walk in and there'd be nothing there. And she's like, do you see it? And I'm like, no, Mom, there's nothing there. And she kept asking me. I was probably 5 through 10 or 12 before I started realizing that process and what she was teaching me, that it was all a process. And so then she would have me come back as, she got the next next segment of it painted or the next layer. She would ask me, do you see it? And that somehow really, really stuck with me going into especially hardware companies. So Kenesaw and Nebullam both having hardware. They, the prototypes, if you brought in someone off the street and said, look at this, they might say like, okay, that's an ugly product, right? And it helped me to understand that that was all just part of the process. So prototyping and how I relate it to painting is just each step along the way. And then you just have to understand that it's all a process.
That's great. Those are such fantastic answers. If you don't mind, I'd love to feedback just a couple things I was hearing. One, I'm hearing a link with this idea of a systems mindset, just like you talked about telling a story by starting at the end. You also talk about making decisions and looking ahead and saying, how can I be okay with the decision I made? Well, I'm going to turn it into an experiment where either I'm right or I learned something. And that sort of takes the anxiety out, especially if, as you suggest, you have in mind, you set, what's my sample size? When will I know an answer in that process? The other thing that I really thought was fascinating when you were talking about learning and self-development is that it sounds like to me a mix of accountability and working smart. In learning theory, we talk about mastery experiences and self-efficacy. And one of the things I hear you saying is that you have to get experts to help you so that you really will make progress. Because if you're not making progress, you won't be able to stick to it. But you also need them there to help with the accountability of just putting in the time and staying focused. So I think you're giving absolutely fantastic advice here. At this point, I'd really like to invite Kevin or Karen or Anna to jump in if you'd like to expand on any of these issues.
Clayton, you talked about the big change of going direct to consumers, and I think the question in my mind and yours and many others is that we've seen these sort of changes in food buying habits and how food is moving, and that was the idea behind your business. But as we hopefully emerge from pandemic time, what things will continue to be different? What things will shift back, or has there been sort of a sea change in how consumers think about where and how they buy and get food delivered, and sort of what does the landscape look like going forward?
Yeah, so a couple of statistics that I think about is, since the pandemic hit, e-grocery is up 500%. That's drastic. And if we go back to normal tomorrow, that does not mean everyone's going to stop utilizing those services. I think, and this is something that we tried to circle back with subscribers on, of if things go back to normal, are you going to return to your previous shopping habits? And our average subscriber right now is a 41 to 65-year-old female, and they were used to going to the grocery store multiple times a week, usually 2 times a week, picking up fresh produce. When everything hit and they didn't feel comfortable going that often, and they started doing delivery, they became paranoid over who was picking out the produce. Was it going to be the produce that they would normally pick out in the store? And now that we focus on just essentially starting with the base of lettuce, we've just become known as, okay, it's the lettuce farm. And that's why we capitalized off of the eatlettuce.com as well. And I think in my mind, I kind of compare it to, we need to do one thing really well. So if Amazon started with just books, we're starting with just lettuce. Ultimately, we want to have more and more food products. And the consumer mindset around, if the pandemic ends tomorrow, what does it look like for getting my groceries or food delivered? There's going to be a huge subset of them that stick with it because they realize for the convenience of it. And especially once they see the proper packaging with it and how it did arrive safely, even if you're in the middle of winter, here in Iowa. That's something that I'm excited about. But then on top of that, organic produce, it grew by over 16% in sales last year, and that's huge for us. We use no pesticides in our farm. In the future, we hope to go after the organic certification with USDA as well. And at the end of the day, all of our future products are now going to be coming from direct feedback from current subscribers. And that's something I'm really excited about as well. So that led into our new product that launches in April, and it's tomatoes. And as we were trialing tomatoes, we were getting tomatoes out to subscribers and chefs in the area for their feedback. And that feedback, it was, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, here's what would need to be changed with the packaging, etc. We've been taking that feedback since essentially right before Christmas time. And we've put all of that into the product we're growing now that then launches in just a couple months. So as long as we can continue to provide the products that more subscribers want, that's how we can continue to grow our base as well.
Clayton, so as I'm thinking about this here, you chose lettuce. You dove deeper into it. You decided to do lettuce well. I think a lot of our young people and our students especially they have the passion, they have a desire. We're training them, we're building them. How do they choose and where do they focus? And because I think that's where the difficulty comes in. How do they land, and how do they know what it feels like to land on something successful? And I think you're really good at articulating that part of it, which is really challenging.
Well, yeah. So there's a few directions you can go. If you have an idea, I would challenge you to think about where did that idea stem from for a business or a product or a service, whatever it is. A lot of people start building the solution to a problem they currently have themselves. And that's not the case for either Kinosol or Nebullam for me. And that I would say is the easiest approach to actually launching something if it's a problem you have that you want to solve yourself. Otherwise, if you come from, let's say, industry, the finance industry, and you notice a couple of problems throughout your 10, 15-year career, a lot of times you become an expert in something and you see how a solution could be fit into everything. And the company you're currently with can't put focus towards that. So you start working on the idea, it takes off, you leave to join your new fintech company full time. That's another direction. For me, maybe I like pain with boxing and ultra running and building companies. But for me, I like the idea of solving a big problem that if you accomplish what you set out for, it changes the world entirely. So at Nebullam, this might sound crazy, but at Nebullam, if we succeed in getting Nebullam farms out into, let's say, the 20,000 US cities, and then from there globally, at the end of the day, we have the chance to remove seasonality from existence. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's something that if everywhere you go, you have access to reliable and local food year round, you no longer have to think about, well, is this in season or not? And that is what drives me, especially for thinking along the lines of thinking and working on the business, not in the business. If there's a really tough week, something doesn't go our way, something happens, going back to that's right, the juice is worth the squeeze. We've got to just keep building, because if we can get this out there and into the world, it'll remove seasonality.
Can I ask somewhat related question? How many designers then do you have? How many lettuce designers do you have in your team? Or how do you, because what I'm being inspired by is you and your team are all from very different domains, and yet you're designing the world with your own two hands, or with your lettuce and your tomatoes. And I'm very curious. Yesterday we had conversations with our grads who say, how do I sell myself? And I want to tell them to want to meet Clayton Mooney. So how does the world of design is connected with that? Because we always hear with connection with innovation, but how can I send them your way?
Yeah, so one, if I can help in any way, if someone just wants to drop in the chat, just my email is just the letter c@nebullam.com. Reach out anytime. So to cover the team, we each fill that puzzle piece, so to speak. So I want to cover a little bit more on our full-time team members right now. So myself, I'm co-founder and CEO. I'm the non-technical co-founder. So to me, it's exciting on the sales side and trying to hustle around different business models. And Danon Poole is our co-founder and CTO. Danon is very much the yin to my yang, so to speak. So he is the design person. Everything from prototype of the smallest scale to working with our commercial manufacturing partners, that is all of his expertise and experience coming into from sketching it out to a Google drawing to a CAD to now it's in front of us and it's growing 4,000 heads of lettuce. That's Danon's expertise and that's his strengths. But then as far as where we were missing on the software side, we just recently had Nick Harry join us. So Nick is our lead software engineer. Nick comes from a background of industrial engineering and is self-taught coder. And that's something that I've noticed there's a trend that if you like to hack together projects as in anything to do with software and you're working outside of, let's say, business hours, then you have that drive and that motivation to actually create bigger value usually. So Nick comes in and joins the software missing puzzle piece for running the equipment. But then all of the rest of our production and our processes in place, there's so many different directions you can go to really bring us all in. We have Sam Parker. So Sam is an Iowa State grad as well, and in supply chain and logistics. And Sam came in and jumped into the farm and said, okay, if this is our inventory, this is our production. And then when we pivoted to a direct consumer, this is our fulfillment. I need to connect all of these. So that's Sam's experience and expertise. And he put everything in place to make all of our lives easier around here. We use a very low code stack for our production and fulfillment platforms. So Airtable is our main focus. I don't know if anyone out there has heard of Airtable, but it's awesome. And just having those processes connected and in place makes all of our lives easier. And that's how we are able to have such a small but mighty team and get a lot of things done, because we're not spending our time on a lot of manual processes that we haven't went from design to something implemented into play.
Clayton, I am curious. I think our students, so as I think about the students that we're coaching to the Student Innovation Fellows Program, and we have 52 now, awesome. Commonly what's coming up is those character traits, those personal traits that both tank you as well as compel you and ensure your success. So if you had to talk about those traits and behaviors that served you well as someone that was able to contribute meaningfully, and think entrepreneurship even, that serve you well to contribute meaningfully, and that those character traits you had to personally struggle with in order to contribute meaningfully. Can you talk about those two things?
So when I think of the traits to take grit and gratitude to another level. So on the grit side, you save yourself a lot of time and heartache if you, again, want to understand where you want to be at the end. And if that's the case, you probably, if you write down, literally, this is what I want the result to be and start working backwards, you can more easily see the missing puzzle pieces that you're going to have to go in search of, right? Whether that's asking someone for help or developing a new technical skill yourself. On the gratitude side, I see that as it's much more on the soft skills. So I know through the Innovation Fellows Program and everything, Aggie I does, it's getting students in front of mentors, in front of people who have been there, done that just a couple years down the line. So it's still very relevant to the feedback they're getting for their business ideas. I think it's so key. And looking back at my second time at Iowa State and wrapping up a degree in English, I wish I would have networked more. I wish I would have asked for help more. And I think everyone should ask for help, twice as much as they think they need it. And I think that's really key. But a lot of time it comes from that development of soft skills of, are you comfortable just talking with people? And then lastly, when you meet someone who has been there and done that, and you want to take advice from them, make sure you are really, really good at listening and taking those notes to reflect upon, because some of the times the advice they'll give will be applicable then, a week from then, or possibly 2 to 3 years down the line. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had an example of, so we're raising a current round for Nebullam for investment. And we had kind of an epiphany over, if at the end of the day, the company has the leverage, when they go to meet with investors, the investor's only job is to sell them capital for the future expected value of the company. And that helps really put more things into perspective over how we can qualify the investors we're talking with, if they have that mindset with us. But in order to do that, we had to talk with essentially mentors and people who had been there, done that. And just a couple years ago, that was mentioned to me, and finally it just clicked this week. So you just never know when you can put that advice into play.
And then speaking of taking advice from mentors, I have a question about how you approach customer feedback. The common theme that I'm personally seeing as we talk about Nebullam is that the customer really is first. You built this entire business based off of the customer, their need, and you focus less on yourself. You're putting all these strategies and tactics in place in order to solicit feedback. So at what point as a business owner do you say, yes, I will accept this feedback, this other feedback, I will accept that too, but maybe we don't act on that? When do you act? When do you not act?
Good questions. We've probably messed that up a lot. We've acted, prematurely and tried to put something into play based on, feedback of one or two individuals that then cause negative feedback from, let's say, 2 to 3 individuals. So that's a fine line that we walk. I'll start with most meal kit delivery services or e-grocery. They are going to look at having a third party as that last mile deliverer. But that's the most important step of all of it, because what if someone comes to the door to actually get their package and that interaction? And there's not a chance you can have a third party delivery person having as much passion and enthusiasm and care for the customer as if it's yourself, right? So with Nebullam, it's a double-edged sword right now because of our scale, but we own the entire supply chain. So our team, as an example, it might be Dana now doing deliveries. Our newest delivery team member, Jack Nelson, who is at Iowa State right now, he's coming face to face with our subscribers weekly or bi-weekly. And a lot of times with our subscribers being older, they don't want to jump on and click a survey link, give us feedback. But if they see us at the door, they'll say, hey, last time you did this, can we change this? Or I have some feedback around this, or the broccoli sprouts were awesome, I want more of those. If we weren't there at that final step, we'd miss out on all of that information, which is the most valuable feedback, and all of that put into play helps control our direction moving forward. So it's how can you have touch points with your users or your customers? And so for us, it's if you're getting weekly lettuce, we have 4 opportunities a month to capture that feedback from you. And at the end of the day, we do have to filter all of the feedback through making sure this is still our big picture and the direction we want to go. I would consider that another example of sample size. So if we have one subscriber nowadays suggest something, if it's an easy fix for them, great, implement it. But then if we have 2 to 3 subscribers suggest something, we look to try to implement it across the board. And it's always changing direction. I would say no one week has been the same since we launched 10-ish months ago with this direct to consumer.
Thank you. And then speaking of big picture, we have a question from Michelle. Michelle wants to know, or she says, I know that there are problems with food being shipped from other countries to consumers, and that affects the nutrients in that produce. How does having a local farm differ from having lettuce shipped to a grocery mart?
So for us, we look at the fresher, the better, longer shelf life. And if, as an example, you are, let's say, buying lettuce at a grocery store that came from California or Arizona, of the 2-week shelf life that lettuce started with, you essentially have 5 or 6 days left. And if that's the case, unless you're enjoying all that salad in those first few days, you're going to end up having to throw away whatever's remaining. And that's something that we want to focus on. So food waste, you curb food waste by supporting local and stay fresher for longer. On the nutrient side, this is part of an educational push for us because of microgreens. Most people don't know what microgreens are, or if you reference microgreens, maybe they've heard of broccoli sprouts before. So a lot of our Our marketing and our rhetoric that we use are just educating the masses on microgreens and all of those nutrients. I believe we are one of just a couple of farms in Iowa that provide year-round harvesting of microgreens, and we currently have 6 different varieties. So we need to do a better job of educating subscribers and potential subscribers on the benefits of microgreens. But at the end of the day, too, supporting local for us, it means that if we can accomplish our mission here, we can create more jobs locally. And then we can expand out and take the brand that we've built here into other locations in Iowa as well.
Yeah, Clayton, I might jump in here because a lot of what you're talking about with your business, particularly in your marketplace, is social innovation. You're basically having to create an awareness campaign and talk to people about why they should do this and why this is a better source. And also you're doing a Change the World project that will improve basically access to food, access to healthy food. So I'm wondering if you can't speak to creating awareness. We have a lot of students who are really passionate about green energy, passionate about many causes. But what are you doing in terms of customer awareness and creating that market for your product? What is the, especially as I think it relates to changing the way they think and believe about their daily practices and habits?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Karen. So one, when you think of marketing, like let's say I'm judging a local pitch competition or attending a local demo day. If a judge or someone from the audience asks the question of, what is your marketing plan? The most common response is social media ads, right?
Right.
So everybody just says social media ads. You have to dive much, much deeper, and that's an ongoing process itself. But something that we have seen big success with, which is in this day and age where everything is going digital, it's offline marketing for us. So we have had door hanger campaigns blanketed across Ames, Ankeny, and Des Moines areas. And almost half of our subscribers have come from door hangers. And in this day and age, door hanger doesn't make sense. I don't know if it would for your business, but in order to test it out and experiment, get a couple hundred out there, see what kind of conversions you're getting. That's pretty important. But then on the other part that I wanted to touch base on is, so about 2 years ago now, I first heard of the concept and really didn't circle back until recently. But there's a movement called building in public for companies. And what that means is essentially you share your metrics and you share under the hood of your company of where you're actually at and what the feedback is, good and bad, from customers. So on January 1st, we decided to move Nebullam to building in public. And most of the time we are tweeting every time we get a new subscriber. Every time a subscriber churns, I'm screenshotting that and just been putting it out there into the world. That has allowed us to, one, not have to keep everything on our shoulders of what's working and what's not working. Two, it's allowed us to build up more brand awareness. And I would call them almost ambassadors, people who've reached out who are not our ideal customer, who said, I like what you're doing here. And because you mentioned this, have you tried this, or can I connect you with so-and-so? So building in public, I think it's going to be a very big movement. It's a little bit slow moving here in the Midwest right now. We're just all super nice people, want to have more private lives. But Nebullam, if we have to lead the way on building in public, we hope to encourage another couple dozen Iowa companies over the next year to also build in public. And that way we can all it's a rising tide raises all ships. We can all put that feedback out there, what's working, what's not working, build up the brand awareness, the following of, I really like what you all are doing. And that's really important for us. So building in public, it's a trending hashtag too. If anyone wants to check on Twitter, there's a lot of companies doing it today.
I have to follow up on one really, first of all, how admirable. One of the things you said earlier is people don't ask for the help that they need. But Clayton, what is really quite amazing is that you are making yourself vulnerable in a public space and, basically showing where the holes are. And instead of that being a possibility of tanking your business, you're actually inviting and engaging people that you would want as customers, right? So that idea of being profoundly vulnerable, what do you do with that feedback when it's not necessarily that terrific? And what makes you even able to have the courage to put it out there in the world?
It's for me personally, and it's very similar for Danon. We want thicker skin, and I think building a company, if you're thick-skinned, you have an easier time at building up the perseverance and getting that grit going. Whenever there's something negative, I cringe, I lose a little bit of sleep over it, but ultimately, if it's out there and into the world, it's no longer on my shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like pulling off the Band-Aid, and it gets me over that situation more easily. That is, when you think about the pros and cons of building in public, to me personally, there's so many more pros than cons. But just as an example, building in public now, it's led us to new subscribers. It has led us to a potential strategic partner. It's led us to a potential franchisee in the Southeast US, and it's led us to potential investors in this round too. So right there in the short term of things, it seems to be working. Now, of course, we continue to pick up subscribers. Things are going well. Will I still be tweeting when things aren't going well, or we have a bad month or something major happens? That's part of the commitment to have to do that.
So Clayton, you talked about building in public and maybe some cultural challenges of doing that in the Midwest. You were accepted into Y Combinator, the program that produced Airbnb and Dropbox, among many others, but you also got to spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley. What things should we from the Midwest, what things can we learn from Silicon Valley, an historic, crazy entrepreneurial place, and what things do we need to build that are our own way of doing things?
Well, a couple of things that go with that one. So one quote that really stuck out to me from the West Coast is, you need to optimize for the upside and don't sweat the downside. And to me, that essentially translates to, here it's, if you have to wind down your company and you have a failure, it's how does the startup community embrace you? And I think we need to, in a way, celebrate when a company is wound down, because that means you're on to your next thing. And especially if you're a serial founder, it's if this doesn't work, on to the next one. No slowing down, no kind of skip in the cadence. So optimizing for the upside, not sweating the downside. Another thing that I think about is if you have a company and you're fundraising, and you are talking with an investor, and just simple math, let's say you're trying to raise $1 million from them, and your valuation after that million is going to be 10 million. Here, that's a pretty big valuation, and it's just different in different places. But if that investor believes that you have a 1% chance of turning into $1 billion company, that is a break-even expected value play. So if it's going to be 10 million now, 100 times, that's $1 billion. And I think that mindset, we need to think more about of not worrying too much about the valuations and focusing on, wow, if this works, this is the outcome. And in order to get that cycle really, really moving along, we need to just have more exits, successful exits of companies in the area. And this past year has been pretty good for Ames. We just need to get that up to 4 or 5 exits a year, because that's ultimately going to turn more individuals into angel investors in the community. And I think that's how you really get that cycle going. And on top of that, the earliest employees joining startups in the area too, becoming angel investors. Like how can you embrace everyone, get them involved with the community, and you pump out a startup, that startup scales, that startup sells, all of a sudden you pump out a dozen new angel investors.
What made Nebullam choose you, Clayton? What do you think made Nebullam made you stand out? Because that's a huge, huge accomplishment. I mean, I don't think we can emphasize enough how significant it was for a company like yours to get in there. So why did they choose you in particular, do you think?
So from our perspective, and we asked our Y Combinator partners after this, and they liked the idea that we painted the picture for most of indoor farming is antiquated. There's a lot of companies working on the hardware or the software, but not both. And then as far as our design goes, that's to all Danon's credit of going and flipping the method from horizontal to vertical. And then something I haven't touched on is how we've mobilized our plant wall. So you can think of it as dry cleaning rack for your plants, and the lights move. So we've been able to cut down on the material costs. But at the end of the day, Y Combinator's focus is heavily on the team of if something goes bad, what happens? So during the interviewing process and the application, they ask about previous projects you've worked with each other on as co-founders. And then they ask you to share something about a problem you solved, how you solved it. And they take a lot of that into consideration, which is my answer was a nerdy math answer of way back in 2009. I was one of maybe 12 or 13 individuals playing online poker full time who applied the Nash equilibrium to the end game of online poker. So you can make the closest to correct mathematical decision when it got down to just you and one other opponent. And that's something that we were able to capitalize off of and later coach other people to learn about. And Danon and myself, the yin and yang, like I mentioned before, just playing to each other's strengths. A lot of days, it's really healthy for us building the company to stay in each other's lanes. So everything non-technical, forward-facing, here I am. Everything internal, technology-facing, there's Danon.
I have one. Oh, Anna, you go. I'll chime in after you.
No, I was going to ask you, can we chime in the last questions that we have from students? Because it really connects with what Karen was asking, like why choose Nebullam? And we have some students who have very specific details that they want to know about your thing. So I think we should bring them on.
Absolutely. So one of the questions that we have from a student is about networking during a pandemic. Clearly, you were doing it right. Things are going very well for you. So could you give some advice for our students who are trying to network and be personable in a very digital space?
If you want to jump into startups, especially here in the area, I would highly recommend checking out 1 Million Cups. So it's a Kauffman Foundation initiative. And pre-pandemic, it was every Wednesday morning throughout the United States. You would have one usually earlier stage company in to present for 10 minutes. The audience would be comprised of investors, community builders, and other founders. And then they would get 30 to 45 minutes of asking you questions and giving you feedback. That's one of the best communities to plug into. So Ben Mcdougall is based in Des Moines, and he is actually in charge. He's the organizer for all of the Midwest 1 Million Cups. He's a great individual to know. But 1 Million Cups is one of the best platforms you could jump into. And they have moved to digital. So every Wednesday morning, for instance, you could jump into 1 Million Cups New York, 1 Million Cups Kansas City, or right here in the backyard, 1 Million Cups Ames, 1 Million Cups Des Moines, and so on and so forth. And then right now, I think if you have business ideas, starting with your professors and just saying, who should I get in front of to talk about my idea? There's so many good local resources. So between this as examples, Aggie I and the Papa John Center for Entrepreneurship. If you contact either, Kevin Kimley at Aggie I or Judy Isles and team at the Papa John Center and describe what you're thinking about, they likely know someone who could help you. Whether that's just figuring out your idea and giving you some feedback on the product or the service, or putting you in contact with potential customers or users, that's really important too. That's where I would start.
Thanks. And then actually Judy Isles just commented and said 1 Million Cups on Wednesday at the core facility. So if you're interested, definitely attend. We have a question here about why, sorry, I'm just trying to process this. In-home vertical gardens, right? So people have the ability to garden on their own. They can go to the grocery store. They can order from you. Could you talk a little bit about your thought process when you were creating this business? Did you consider those other ways that people could possibly grow their own lettuce or maybe get it from the store? Could you let us in on some of your insight and what you may have found during your research?
Yeah, so we've had the opportunity to go the direct consumer route for our growing equipment. Personally, we've just always been more excited by the commercial scale. You walk into a facility and there's just hundreds of thousands of heads of lettuce growing. And the logistics and that process behind that are what drives us. And when we think about our technology and ultimately getting to a point to where Nebullam farms are fully automated. That's much more exciting for us. And as a sci-fi nerd, I think about, the future. You walk into this warehouse and there's just no one there and all the lettuce is growing. And that's another driver for it. But as far as in-home appliances, that is a really interesting space. It's picking up a lot of steam, and companies like Rise Gardens are really awesome and focused on the users. And a lot of the companies are focused on doing the Keurig method. So essentially, you get the in-home unit and you want to grow basil. Great. There's a little plug for basil. Remove the top, drop it in the unit, mix that with your lettuce, your pea shoots, whatever it may be, and come back. But I think that's going to be, like, personally, that's a smaller segment to focus on. And we want to focus on the majority of people who don't want to have to worry about growing food at their house or within their homes. So it's just two different directions to go. And we definitely considered that in the past. But at the end of the day, excited for just the scale of automated indoor farms.
If I can ask one quick follow-up on that, Clayton, I'm curious about the story you tell about your company. What I'm hearing is predominantly, given your audience and how you're selling it, it's the convenience and it's that local relationship. I can imagine other selling points that may be a little different. It could be about knowing that where it comes from and less concern about contagion or pesticides or the organic angle. How do you think about validating which message and which target groups and what they care about as you grow into other markets?
So that is quite the learning curve for us as well. So with the lettuce, from the earliest days of where we had a pilot project going into beta to having a small prototype set up in the Aggie I office to show people, that time when growing lettuce, we weren't sure, is it good? Are we growing it the right way? And the only way we could confirm if we were going in the right direction is starting to talk to chefs and restaurant owners and produce managers. So really getting in front of them for that feedback on, is this product good enough to put on your store shelves or on a plate you're going to serve at a dinner? And that's something we had to iterate upon. And we grew a lot of bad lettuce before we could grow some good lettuce. And from there, once lettuce was the foundation, and we saw it as, because it's a product that we can move the volumes, then branching out into microgreens with our equipment, they complement our growing equipment well. They're simpler for us to manage. And we noticed that not too many others in the area were growing microgreens. So getting that feedback from mostly chefs on the microgreens over, did we harvest at the right time? Does this pack the flavor that it needs to be the complement on top of a nicer dish? On the tomatoes, once we've established the subscriber base with our new business model, on the tomatoes, almost all of that feedback has come from our subscribers and produce managers. And that's allowed us to get to that point to where, one, a lot of times it starts with the eyes. If you're shopping in a grocery store and you see produce, it's, what does it look like? And of course, you can't taste test it so easily there too. So making sure the visual appeal is there and the taste is as fresh as possible for us. Those are the two big selling points for us. When I think of other products, we hope to be able to replicate what we've done with the tomatoes. And we're looking at cucumbers, peppers, and in the future, even potentially strawberries over the next couple of years. Hopefully that gives a little bit of an example.
No, thank you so much. Well, I think we could talk all day, and I think many of our audience members would like us to. I just got to get a quick shout out to Brandon, who says, "Wow, this guy is amazing," and I have to heartily agree. So thank you so much for your time today, Clayton, and I'll allow our other moderators to give their thanks and final thoughts.
Well, yes, I would follow immediately because I want to say, Abram just nailed it. We would talk with you the whole day. We have one last question, I would say. You talked about seasonality and you're inverting the way that we think about vertical farming. So you are an innovator, but you're also a provocateur. So I think we have to have another 1.5 hours to actually why making such provocative claims, especially in the farming heart of the country. But I just, on behalf of the world of design and innovation, I wanted to thank you. You are really so down to earth, and I'm going to do the pun of the lettuce. So down to earth and really so kind and generous in sharing all your ups and downs and the failures as moving forward. So thank you very much. It has been very inspiring. I'm guessing that all our students are going to write to you soon, but okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anyone else want to say anything before I close today?
I'll chime in too. Clayton, thank you so much for joining us. I love gardening. Vegetable gardening is my thing. I can also speak to being sold different things in the grocery store by seeing it. I will literally buy 5 pounds of tomatoes. If the Roma tomatoes look bright, I'm like, I'm taking them home. I'm going to can them. I'll figure out a way to do it. But thank you for all of your work that you're doing. And I can't wait to see what you do next. I'm also excited to try out your service. Judy Isles also gave a very positive review about the service. So anyone looking to try it out, definitely visit the website. But Clayton, thank you for joining us. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you very much.
Clayton, just really quite amazing in so many ways. I know you were the person that introduced an unconference, where you're the person that is ideally, instead of holding tightly and looking at being more focused, holding loosely, which takes a lot of incredible mental capacity. And so I just want to say it's an incredible invitation for our innovators and something to aspire to. And that's why I'm really grateful that we had this time with you. So thank you for joining us today. I will end today by saying we have many more exciting things coming up on our people, different walks of life. Next week, we have Steve Johans, who does Village Solution. He works in that last mile entrepreneur space and looks at ag solutions as well as connectivity in the last mile developing countries, Ethiopia and India specifically. Really has done incredible work and has received a lot of USDA support and is very passionate about helping young entrepreneurs in those countries. Also, we have on the 26th, we have really an incredible opportunity here. The Idea Man with Idea Labs. I don't know if you've heard of Bill Gross with Idea Labs. He's spun off 150 companies in the last 25 years and has really been, he was responsible for the engine that fuels Google and is quite a compelling speaker. He will be coming to Iowa State, or at least online in our innovation forum. And I think we put a link in the chat earlier today. So that's something that you don't want to miss. But for today, I just want to say thank you. And we will see you next week with Steve Johans. And please remember to check out our website. Bye, team.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Take care.